Do you think we could move this back just a little bit? Make it a little easier for the speakers? There we go. I like to see what I'm talking about sometimes.
Oh, I don't know.
As soon as you're ready, Tom. Okay, if we could have the lights. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is just try to run down with you the basic habitat needs for sage grouse. And sage grouse use different habitats at different times of the year, so I've broken the talk apart accordingly. And there's also a spatial aspect to sage grouse habitats, and I'm going to talk about that later on today, not too much right now. I want to start with what we call the breeding habitat, which consists of the leks that I think everybody knows about, as well as nesting habitat and early brood rearing habitat, which over the years I think we've given a lot less attention to. Sage grouse, as Clayton mentioned, are a lekking species. This is what we normally see. Lots of people like to go out and watch this spectacular display. Consequently, a lot of attention has been paid to sage grouse leks, where they are, what kind of terrain they occur on. Folks, this is totally unimportant in the scheme of things. Okay? Leks can occur in the bottom of gravel pits. They can occur in burrow pits and on roads and on landing strips. What is important is the adjacent habitat that provides nesting cover and early brood rearing habitat, and that's what determines how many sage grouse we have. So that's what we want to concentrate on. There are two aspects of nesting habitat that we really need to think about, and for years biologists have concentrated a lot of their effort on trying to understand the overstory, the sagebrush overstory, and we really didn't spend a lot of time looking at the herbaceous cover associated with nest sites. And what we found out more recently by work in Colorado and in Oregon and Idaho is that this is very, very important in terms of driving sage grouse populations and affecting nest success, both the new growth as well as, if you look closely, you can see the residual growth from last year, providing lateral cover. This hen is sitting on a nest. You'll also notice there's very little sunshine hitting this hen because she has a very good sagebrush overstory. So she has protection from above as well as protection from below. Okay. In terms of data, scientists always have to throw out a little bit, but we can look across the species range and see that the height of sage grouse nest sites, the plants under which they nest, the shrubs, run from about 40 to a little low under 80 centimeters. That's less than 3 feet. They're relatively short plants. Okay? The canopy cover generally runs from 15 to sometimes over 30%. Generally speaking, we like to see about a 15 to 25% canopy cover of sagebrush. Okay? And as I said, there's less information on grass height, grass canopy cover, and associated forbs. But again, generally, anything over 18 centimeters is considered pretty good as it's measured in May, and grass canopy cover 15 to 20 or 25% plus. Okay? Now, some of you in the room may be out stumbling around in the spring and find a sage grouse nest under a rabbit brush. Dr. Schroeder, working in Washington, has documented a number of nests under things other than sagebrush, but a common point you'll hear us researchers make is that sage grouse nest under sagebrush. They do most of the time. About 20% of the time they may pick something else, a rabbit brush or a bitterbrush plant or a dead shrub, or sometimes they think they're pheasants and nest under clumps of grass. Okay? And so folks will raise the question, well, if they'll nest under other things, why do we need so much sagebrush? Why can't we deal with less sagebrush and have more grass, and grouse will use that? Well, that's a fair question, and we have an answer for that question. First of all, let me point out that when we look at nests under sagebrush plants versus non-sagebrush plants, the umbrella plant, the overhead cover, is generally greater for sagebrush versus non-sagebrush. But interestingly, the herbaceous cover is not. It's the same or maybe even a little greater for non-sagebrush plants. Basically, this is telling us that the birds are looking at two components when they're selecting a nest site. 1, the shrub overstory, 2, the associated herbaceous cover. So what happens to these critters then? Well, if a sage grouse picks a sagebrush shrub to nest under, on average, at least in Idaho, she has better than a 50% chance of being successful long term. If she picks a non-sagebrush plant, only about a 20% chance. That's why we need sagebrush in our nesting habitat. Okay? They won't survive with that kind of a nest success. All right, moving on to early brood rearing habitat. Please do not confuse this with what we may call summer habitat or later brood rearing habitat, which often occurs near agricultural areas and in riparian zones and so forth. Early brood rearing habitat, from the time the chicks hatch till they're 4, 5, or 6 weeks old, basically occurs in sagebrush uplands. And if that's not in focus, you'll have to, I can't tell this close. Anyway, sagebrush uplands in and adjacent to nest sites. There's a sage grouse nest right here. And the birds will spend the first few weeks of their life foraging, feeding, loafing, and so forth in this kind of a habitat. This is critical habitat for sage grouse as well. And again, what makes it good or bad is not only the sagebrush overstory, but if you look closely, a healthy herbaceous understory and bugs. In this case, ants. This is big desert data from eastern Idaho, and basically what we see is there's a lot more ants at brood use sites than there are at random sites. Okay? Work in Wyoming has also shown that without insects to provide high-quality protein diet, these young chicks, 1, 2, 3 weeks old, will not survive very well. So for a sage grouse hen, you need sagebrush overstory plus herbaceous cover. For these little guys to get along, a third component is added in, a healthy insect population. All right, let's move on now to something I consider a little bit less critical in terms of habitat. That would be summer range. And you can think of summer range coming in 2 kinds. One, often used by hens with broods, and other areas that are used mostly by adult males and sometimes unsuccessful hens. We'll get to winter range here in a few minutes. All right, a good example in Idaho, anyway, of what we might see for summer range for sage grouse this year. This is the mouth of the Little Lost River Valley in eastern Idaho, and we have an alfalfa field adjacent to a wet stringer meadow, adjacent to a stand of sagebrush that provides escape and loafing cover for grouse. They like to feed here and here, and at night they generally move out into these areas. Okay? Males, on the other hand, and we've had this happen, radio mark males are just as likely to overfly this stuff and end up on some of the ridges in this mountain chain in the background. This happens to be the Lemhi Range, and along some of these steeper slopes. So in a more harsh environment. This is what's more important for sage grouse. So, there are lots of different kinds of habitats grouse will occupy during the summer. This is one example. High mountain meadows and old burns at 8,000 and 8,500 and 9,000 feet in elevation are another kind of habitat that are used commonly by birds. My pointer is locked up on a brood of sage grouse that are sitting right about there now, and you can see a large number of forbs in this photo. Not too much in the way of shrubs. The birds will actually pop off the edge and roost in sagebrush that are along the edge of this ridge during the night, and then spend most of the day feeding in this kind of an area. Okay, generally for a sage grouse during the summer, it doesn't matter. They'll use alfalfa fields, they'll use potato fields, they'll use riparian zones. The key is, can they get their little beaks on succulent forbs and some insects? Clover, dandelion, Chinese lettuce, anything of that sort is fair game for a sage grouse, and that's what they're looking for. So they have a fairly wide tolerance of habitats during the summer. They're not narrow like they are in the spring and again in the winter. Okay, now I didn't mention fall simply because there really is no fall habitat for a sage grouse. That's a time of transition. People tend to be out hunting sage grouse at the time. They may see a lot of birds, but by and large, sage grouse during September and October are still on summer range, but as the fall progresses, the birds tend to move off of these slopes and out of the alfalfa areas to sagebrush stands where they will often be found in groups of 100 to 300 and 400 birds, and then, depending on snowfall, redistribute themselves out to very traditional winter ranges. Okay, in winter, I know there's a sort of a mindset. People think that game birds die in the winter. Sage-grouse don't die in the winter, folks. They are very well adapted to dealing with temperatures well below zero. Okay, snow that may be 2 and 3 feet deep. They're highly mobile critters, as you can see in this slide. We've got a flock of sage-grouse behind us, and they will use fairly sparse habitats, oftentimes during the winter. This particular stand of sagebrush was used throughout most of this winter when the photo was taken. You can see it's quite open. A sage-grouse will stand out here. You can see them quite a long ways away, but their general predator avoidance strategy is to occur in large flocks, see the bad guy before the bad guy sees them, and then fly away. Okay, but there's still plenty to eat out here, and they will also snow roost. They can get down out of the nasty kinds of blowing snow, drifting snow, and so forth. However, from time to time, we do have bad winters, and traditional ranges may be covered by snow. We do also have range fires, and traditional winter ranges may be burned, and that's the case in this photo. There was a wildfire that kind of went through this, or not a wildfire, prescribed burn, that went through this area. We had radio marked birds using this area at the time, and the birds simply moved from here over into this area and on the other side of the butte. They just shifted their movements about 5 kilometers. Okay, no big deal. Unfortunately, as Director Maley indicated, in 1996, this entire area and every single piece of sagebrush that you see in this photo was burned by a wildfire that was over 200,000 acres. It took out everything. It also took out this area that was burned or hit by a prescribed burn in '89, so it was reburned again. In the following year, elect counts were down quite a bit, suggesting that we did lose birds over the wintertime, that there was no place for these birds to go. So we can have those catastrophes, which then do affect these birds in the wintertime. But by and large, birds can deal with winter pretty well. I'll give you one more example of that. Really good winter range, at least my idea of really good winter range, can be found in eastern Idaho in what's the lower Birch Creek Valley. And here we have an interspersion of habitats. This is Artemisia arbuscula, or low sage, and it's intermixed with stands of big sage. And the birds really like, as well as antelope, really like feeding in low sage flats. And they do so until, and low sage is only about this tall, okay? And until it's covered by snow, which it is most years, and then they simply pop over into these taller stands of big sage, Artemisia tridentata. If this area gets covered by snow, the birds just simply drift down the valley until they hit an area of exposed sagebrush. So it's pretty much an ideal situation for them. They have access to sagebrush under all snow conditions. Remember, in the wintertime, pretty much the only thing sage-grouse eat is a sagebrush leaf. Now, to give you an idea of how well these birds can adapt or acclimate themselves to nasty conditions, at the upper end of the Birch Creek Valley is another mountain valley, the Lemhi Valley. You have to go over Gilmore Summit and get to the Lemhi Valley. Last year, we had some radio-marked birds in the Lemhi Valley. A very, very bad blizzard hit in January, and a couple of the old males just decided to tough it out, mostly by snow roosting. One of the females in the Lemhi got up, flew all the way down Birch Creek, out of the mouth of Birch Creek, onto the INEEL, into an area that was totally free of snow. And she stayed there until mid to late March, and by late March she was back up adjacent to the lek that she was caught on the year before. That's a round trip of something well over 100 miles. And at the time, we had radio-marked grouse here. She flew, using this as winter range, and she flew over those birds, I guess her idea of a vacation in Florida. Anyway, they are capable of those kinds of movements and adapting to a point. But when, again, that's more of a natural condition as opposed to the catastrophic fire that I mentioned a few minutes ago. All right, and finally, if we want to look at characteristics of sagebrush in winter, in sage-grouse range, it's a little easier for managers to manage for sage-grouse winter range because they only have one component to worry about, and that being sagebrush. And so the canopy cover ranges up to sometimes over 40% in Colorado, but oftentimes we'll see birds using 15 to 20 or 25% canopy cover. This is with snow on the ground, and a mean height of 25 to about 50 centimeters, and that's above the snow. Again, measured in different areas in different states, but fairly similar data. Okay, and with that, if I have time, I'll take just a couple of questions.
Question or clarification or anything, or will this be cut on the same site?
I have one question. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, the birds may do fly. Do you have anything on the kinds of things that makes them want to fly? Specifically, I'm wondering if juniper approached us by not only altering their habitat, maybe altering the use.
Sure. Indirectly, we do. If you look at the Birch Creek Valley and the Little Lost River Valley, they lie next to one another in eastern Idaho. And in Birch Creek, birds from the leks at the mouth of the valley simply go up and down the valley. In the Little Lost area, that whole mouth of the valley has been developed by agriculture as opposed to juniper. And the birds do not go up and down the valley. They're short-stopped at the agricultural lands for the most part. And they go from the leks to the ag lands. Now, whether they can't fly over those or simply the ag lands provide a suitable substitute for natural high elevation, which I don't know. There does seem to be some reluctance, and I'll talk about that a little while later where we get into landscape ecology and habitat fragmentation and so forth. Pardon? They're a very powerful flyer, though. We have seen them flying over the Lemhi Range, so I know they can fly over some juniper, but how much, I don't know. How much of an area is an obstacle? That's one of those things we need to know about. Right.
Another question?
This way.
I'm sure this is something that will come up later probably, but your comment about leks being really not all that important.
The physical,
Rooting habitat is
right.
important, but our management conservation emphasis is on leks.
The leks provide a focal point. They tell us where the birds are in the springtime and give us the approximate location of these important nesting habitats and early brood-rearing habitats. No, I'll talk about circles later. Circles are horrible. We don't draw circles anymore. I'll get to that in the next talk. Yes, sir.
You talked about the early brood rearing period.
Right.
That's the most critical, you feel, during the lifespan of these
Well,
trout?
if the little guys don't survive, you don't have to worry about them filling summer or winter range. So it's pretty darn critical. But asking whether, say, early brood-rearing habitat is more important than, say, winter range, it's almost the chicken versus the egg, which came first. Because if you don't have winter range, then they don't survive to reproduce. Similarly, if the young can't survive, they don't survive. They're not there to occupy winter range. So I like to start with the breeding habitat and get people to understand that breeding habitat consists of both nesting habitat and this early brood-rearing range, which allows the chicks to survive.
And you said that's like early brood rearing hatch to 6 weeks?
So approximately, each hen you'll see a variation with regard to when the hens pick their broods up and start making these very traditional movements. And I'll give you an example of that later on. But in fact, some hens will not move their broods until mid or late August to, say, alfalfa fields. Others will leave in June. Sometimes that's affected by the quality of the rangeland and how much spring precipitation we've had. Yes, sir.
You talked about the importance of insects in random sites versus brood sites. So the brood sites normally associated with wet meadows?
No. This is early spring yet. The birds have not moved to wet meadows. This is sagebrush upland yet. Okay, so these are the insects that we normally find associated with sagebrush bunchgrass steppe. Okay. Yes, sir.
Maybe another way to get at this, what's the most critical habitat thing is in spring, early summer, or winter, do they have the widest tolerance for different habitats? You've already told us, I think, that they've got a wide tolerance
In summer.
in summer or in the winter.
No, they have a wide tolerance for what they'll use during summer. In winter, they're back to sagebrush uplands. Okay.
So that would translate into they have a narrow tolerance,
Right.
and that becomes real.
Very critical, and the same is true in spring. A narrow tolerance. Yes.
cosmological effect on birds early in the spring as it relates to foraging?
Well, give me a couple more years, and the question was climatological effects and how can weather affect brood foraging. We know that we suspect that certain weather events may cause a fairly high mortality in chicks. For instance, cold, wet, rainy weather. This year we had cold, wet, rainy weather, and I thought I lost a lot of broods until I let my pointing dog do some of the work for me, and I found out the broods survived just very fine. It was I was mistaking a behavior by the hen where she would get up apparently by herself and fly long distances, and I thought, gee, she doesn't have a brood, while we were radio tracking these birds. Well, then I brought my pointer in one day, and the pointer found that radio mark 10 for me, and she did her thing, flew a long ways. Then the pointer came back and showed me where her brood was, and what we found out was the hens have two different behaviors. That if they see you coming, if they know a predator is coming towards them, that she'll ditch the kids, hide them, and then she'll take off and go off for 100, 200, or 300 yards, and then when you get towards her, when the predator gets towards her, she'll flush and fly a long ways. If you come around a corner or over a hill with the same pointing dog, they don't know you're there until you're right on top of them. Then you see a brood or a hen distraction display and some squawking and a short flight. For years I thought, okay, if they showed the distraction display, they had a brood, even if you didn't see the chicks. If they flew a long ways, they had lost a brood. That's not true. Okay, so some of the ideas about what it takes to kill off young chicks in terms of weather events, pretty poorly understood at this point. And we can guess at it. Obviously, if it snows on a bunch of chicks that can't thermoregulate, they're going to die. Yeah.
One last question, then we should really move on to Stan.
Okay. Go ahead, yeah.
Jack, and perhaps might address this, but apart from yourself from the agenda, but I had a question, kind of thinking about the behavioral ecology of the birds and the implications for population management. Would you describe bee collecting birds as basically matriarchal and that the hens and choose and best nesting and early brood rearing habitat are determining where those nests end up being positionally located?
If I had to guess, and there's, we're taking our best guess here at this sort of thing, but I believe that the leks are located adjacent to adequate nesting habitat, and maybe sometimes between traditional summer or traditional winter range and nesting habitat, and that would be determined by where the males are going to run into the ladies during the spring. Yeah. But I know there are other theories out there, and I have fairly open mind on it at this point. Okay.
Stan Spider will continue to